justice system. I'll come to that at the end. The criminal justice system that we have today did not grow out of the traditional criminal justice adjudication that we had in our country, but that traditional system or method or lack of method was replaced by English common law, criminal law and criminal law. But common law is used for law as it grew in the lives of the English people. In that sense, since wherever there are human communities, there tend to be similar problems. A solution found in one place need not be a response to crime and does not leave it to the individual to respond. There is a distinction here between the criminal justice and the civil justice. Don't pay back the money. That is a civil offense. It is a law understands it as an offense only against you, not against society. But if in the course of the civil offenses I get angry or you get angry and I kill you or you kill me, that is no longer an offense only against the person who has been assaulted. It's an offense against society, investigating, prosecuting, punishing. I am the complainant, and when the trial comes, I am a witness. Nothing more than that. Unless the police are very efficient, very honest in the prosecution, the victims feel helpless, frustrated in the course of criminal prosecution. Law. All are equal before the law simply means that all persons who are equally situated will be treated equally by the law. I mean, this is very important in a country like India, which has entered our consciousness so much. I find it remarkable that the Constitution should say all are equal before the law. But for the criminal justice system, as well as a suspect, both should be equally protected by the law. It's very important. Not only the victim, but the person who is suspected or accused or punished, he also has to be given protection by the law, not protection to escape punishment or escape prosecution, protection to face the prosecution, protection to the suspect against arbitrary punishment, against unfair trial, against unreasonable, unjust methods of proof. So you are not required to tell the police whether you have done this or you have not done this. Even if you tell something, it is not admissible as evidence in a court of law. Even if you confess, even if you admit, it is not admissible to the police. If you admit to somebody, to that extent, not only that, the law goes to the Indian Penal Code goes to the extent of saying that any pressure put upon a person to confess to a crime, putting the pressure is itself an offense for the criminal justice system. You won't find these things written down anywhere in the law. That's how the system is shaped. And for this reason also the law says in section 57 of the Code of Criminal Procedure that a person taken into custody shall be taken to court within 24 hours. The Constitution itself is very cautious that the state, while performing its job of investigating crimes, does not. In which case, if the police go and pick up that object where he has said it is there, that little part of his statement, one sentence will be admissible. I hid it there. What precedes, what follows is not evidence. This little bit is there, and this has led to custody any time in the course of his remand prior to the filing of the charge sheet. That again gives the police a handle to take him into custody at any time, torture him any time, keeps him in permanent, perpetual tension. Ordinary law does not permit. The first time he is taken to court, he can be given to police custody by the magistrate for 1 or 2 days. But once he is sent to jail, he faces the law. He faces the charge sheet, faces the prosecution, but he will never get into the hands of the police once again. That is the ordinary law. Believing quite rightly that the job of prosecution is not to put pressure upon the fellow to confess. That is not the job of prosecution. The job of prosecution is to find evidence, find out what has happened, get people, get evidence, and see whether this fellow has committed the offence or not. Somebody gave the police a complaint that both of them have been killed and finished off by the father of the girl because the boy happened to be of slightly lower caste. The police arrested the father. This much one can understand. You can have a suspicion, you can take him to custody. Nobody is saying you shouldn't interrogate. He confessed that he had done that. He confessed that he had killed both of them, put them in a gunny bag, thrown them into the Godavari canal system. They searched, but they didn't find anything there. A charge sheet was also filed. They went up for trial. One fine day, both the boy and girl came back. If it had been simply a case where police suspected, they were interrogating, then the boy and girl came back, I can fully understand. I am not saying police should keep quiet, they should not have any suspicion. How did this fellow confess? Obviously, Between confessing to a murder and facing trial and being thrown into the river, he thought he is better. And you know the next thing that happened, the police then charge sheeted the father for giving a false confession intentionally to mislead the police. The father came running to me, I had to file a petition in the High Court to stay the second thing. High Court had to say, this is stupid, you can't do this. No, the girl didn't even die when the question was giving a false confession. There are such instances. Okay, right. So then he goes to jail. Then the burden is upon the prosecution to investigate, file a charge sheet. The prosecution carries the full burden of proving the offence beyond reasonable doubt. Not beyond doubt, but beyond. You are not interrogate that fellow. No court can come in the way of investigation until the charge sheet is filed. Entire process is divided like this. Investigation ends with filing of charge sheet. With the filing of charge sheet, police come out with their case. They say, we have investigated, this is what we have found, such persons are guilty. That is the point up to which the policeman is the prince of the story. From there, the court takes over. Until that point, no court will interfere. A policeman is full confines of the legal provisions of the Code of Criminal Procedure, which laid out the procedure by which he has to do the task. And no court should interfere. But it still happens that our High Court especially periodically stays FIRs. It should not do. Supreme Court itself don't do it. If your FIR is very fanciful, you stay the arrest of the person. Let the investigation go on. But some of our judges are inclined to stay the investigation also, which is wrong. Basically, once a cognizable offence takes place, the duty is there upon, because this is second limb. All are equally protected, means the suspect has to be protected, the victim also has to be protected. Second limb is that every serious offence at least, there will be little trivial offences which the police may say is not an offence at all. Section 154 CRPC permits the policeman to say no great offence has taken place, I won't investigate. Once a cognizable offence is made out, the police must necessarily investigate fully, adequately. Entire resources of the state are with the police, and no court can come in the way, should come in the way until the day on which the charge sheet is filed. That is the extent of protection the victim gets, provided of course the police are honest, dedicated, efficient. These are virtues missing in the police department as much as in any other department of the government. I am not blaming the police particularly. Efficiency, honesty, these are absent everywhere. They are absent in the police department also. This is where the victims continuously feel frustrated and nothing is happening. Have sophisticated methods of investigation. Now we often hear of modernization of the police force, rationalization of the police force, technological inputs, new language also being used. All that it means is that from old muskets, they now have AK-47 rifles. From bicycles, now even a head constable has a motorcycle. And no sub-inspector will get on from a jeep. No question of his travelling on a bicycle or anywhere. In childhood, we used to say sub-inspector going on a bicycle. And in the Telangana part of Andhra Pradesh, where Naxalites are active, we have police stations which are built like forts. Even the Kakatiyas and the Nizams of Hyderabad never had such forts as we have police stations here. That is modernization. That is technological input. Investigative modernization, investigative technological inputs are zero. If you introduce that, the victim also gets the benefit of a genuine, as efficient as modern technology and science permits. Investigation, the suspect also will be free from torture. Let the court has to enter into the legal part of it. That part is the. Now the changes sought to be brought about by the Malimath committee in this part is, because the assumption underlying this once again is that when society organized as the state prosecutes somebody, wants to punish somebody, then it cannot behave arbitrarily or unjustly or unreasonably as an individual may behave. An individual, not that individual has the right to be arbitrary, individual may be arbitrary, individual may be unreasonable. That's exactly where you want a state. Why do you want a state? Why do you want a government? Why do you want courts? Precisely because individual human beings are not always reasonable, not always fair, not always just. But because they are so, the state cannot duplicate the same arbitrary, unjust, unreasonable behavior of individual, in which case the whole rationale for the state, as understood in ordinary common sense, is lost. So the assumption is that, now as an individual, it frequently happens that I have a strong suspicion that some fellow has done harm to me, I go and beat him up. The state cannot do that. But when the state is careful not to do that, it may often happen that somebody who is really guilty is escaping. That may happen is an underlying notion of modern civilization. it may happen in the care that you take to ensure that innocent people are not punished. It may very well happen that guilty go scot-free. That is a price that we have to pay for a fair and just civilization, because no innocent person shall be punished by the state. Escape, even a single innocent person shall not be punished. The assumption, the philosophical argument underlying this notion is that state can never reduce itself to the status of an individual, an ordinary person. It is precisely because ordinary persons may behave unjustly that we require an organization called the state to check such behavior as between people. The state cannot therefore say, I will adopt the same logic as individuals. Often we get into this argument when we argue against death penalty. Somebody has been cruelly killed. What is wrong if the fellow who has killed is killed? That's at an individual level, yes. It's a perfectly reasonable argument. If my very close friend has been murdered, I feel so angry, I may go and murder that fellow. That's at individual level. Morally, many people may find it justified. It's not an easy thing to say it is unjustified, at least. But can the state organize, society organize as the state for the purpose of dealing with justice, can it react the same way as an individual would react? That's a much more difficult question. And unless we put in ourselves in a calm frame of mind where we can put this question to ourselves, we can never understand the rationale of a rights-oriented criminal justice system. Otherwise, we tend to often react when the most important thing when you are discussing the rights aspect of criminal justice system is to first of all stop thinking as an individual who may have been injured. That I have explained. But when it comes to punishment, firstly, there is no philosophy of punishment in underlying the penal provisions of the Indian Penal Code. There is no philosophy of punishment. Why do we punish? Is a question that is neither addressed nor answered in the law. It is a question that the courts in our country have very carefully kept away from answering. As far as criminal justice system is concerned, the courts have said many things which are part of the law which are not written down anywhere in the law. For instance, that proof shall be beyond reasonable doubt is not written anywhere in the law. You won't find it written anywhere in any law. It's an assumption of the Indian criminal justice system laid down by the courts. Secondly, that every crime is an offence against society, not against an individual, is an assumption elaborated by the courts. You won't find it written down anywhere in the law. So procedurally, as far as procedure is concerned, from the point of view of procedural fairness, the Code of Criminal Procedure, Evidence Act, as we have them, are reasonably fair, and the courts also have added to the fairness of these procedures. But when it comes to punishment, no philosophy of punishment has been added, expressed, enunciated by the courts. They had this opportunity when the constitutional validity of death penalty came before the Supreme Court again and again. The argument against death penalty put forward in the courts and outside was that punishment shall not be retributive. Punishment is not a matter of revenge. If you say because he has killed, he should die, if that is the argument in defense of death penalty, then somebody who breaks your hand must also have his hand broken. Somebody who breaks your skull must have his skull broken. And somebody who burns your house, his house must be burnt by the police. But you don't do that. For every other offence, the punishment is not equal to the offence. Why should only for murder, because he has killed, he should be killed? That is, why should the notion of retributive punishment, punishment being equal to the offence, be brought forward only in the case of capital offence, whereas in every other offence it has been taken away? Today we won't even seriously consider that if somebody has burned the haystack of one farmer, his haystack must be burned by the court. We will laugh if somebody says this, but we won't laugh if somebody says, when he has killed, what is wrong if he is hanged? That argument we regard as a serious argument. Partly because of lack of logical, philosophical comprehension of these things. But what does the law do? The law leaves a degree of elasticity, but puts it entirely at the discretion of the judges sitting there. The elasticity is in this, that if you look at Indian Penal Code or any law, it does not prescribe a fixed punishment for any offence. There is no fixed punishment for any offence. For all offences, punishments are prescribed as imprisonment up to a maximum of 10 years, up to a maximum of 7 years. Up to a maximum, the law is elastic, it leaves it to the discretion of the judge sitting there. Sometimes a minimum is also prescribed. Imprisonment of minimum of 6 months, but going up to 7 years. Imprisonment minimum of 2 years, going up to 5 years. The law never says, for this offence, this alone shall be the punishment. Because there the law is positive in the sense that it understands that the offence may be the same. I may have killed someone. But the circumstances are as varied as there are human beings, as there are social situations. So the court must have the discretion. In the case of theft, in the case of beating, in the case of torture, whatever offence, court must have the discretion to impose varying punishments depending upon the circumstance, the person's history, situation, and so on and so forth. That elasticity is required. It is there in the law with only one exception. That is in the case of murder. For murder, once the offence is held to be proved, either life imprisonment or death penalty are the only two things. Less than life imprisonment, the court cannot award. Once the court is convinced that so-and-so has committed the murder, he can be hanged or he can be sentenced to life imprisonment. Court cannot say, for these and these reasons, I think this fellow shall be in jail for 10 years, that is sufficient. Court does not have the discretion. It's an important point that which people like Justice Malimat ignore. In a large number of cases, murder cases, accused get acquitted because when there is a slight doubt, the judge will be, if I swing to this side, I will be sending this fellow to life imprisonment, I don't have the freedom to give him less than that. That doubt makes judges acquit a large number of people in murder cases. If you really want that more cases of murder, there should be punishment. Amend section 302 so that a judge can also give a lesser punishment than life imprisonment. You will find a large number of convictions with lesser punishment because the margin of doubt at the border, the judge will feel, okay, this much doubt I have, I will send him for 5 years. But in the case of murder, that freedom is not available to the. He has to be sent either to life imprisonment or to the gallows. Of course, there was section 303 in the Indian Penal Code which said, if somebody commits a murder, while already under punishment for murder, he shall be only hanged and nothing else. That was struck down by Supreme Court. Supreme Court said you can't have only a single punishment, an alternative has to be there. 303 has been struck down. So even if somebody who is, let us say, in prison, suffering life imprisonment for murder, commits a murder in jail, 303 said he must be hanged and nothing else. Supreme Court said, no, you can't have that. There can be 100 reasons. You should also have the alternative of life imprisonment. But then Parliament should, and law commissions should, people like Justice Malimat should say, not only life imprisonment, lesser punishment should also be available, so that judges will not acquit people on slight doubt, because once he is convinced, if he has sent that argument which destroys the liberality of the criminal justice system, which tries to make it uncivilized, illiberal as against the accused. The victim and the accused are put against each other. As a matter of fact, they will be against each other. But in the system, they shall not be treated as being against each other for the purpose of destroying the civilized character of the system. It often happens like that. But there are cases where the recent Gujarat case, where the Best Bakery case, now that's an instance where the victim or a witness who was very close to the victim, she herself deposed in a trial court saying that nothing happened. In fact, it was the BJP leaders who protected us. It was the Vishnu Parishad leaders who protected us. At the end of the trial, when all of them were acquitted, she went and said, we were forced, we were coerced to say this. Now the legal question here is, when a witness who goes to the court and says one thing and then after everything is over, the person is acquitted, can she come out and say, we were forced, we were coerced, will a retrial be held? It's a very difficult thing which Supreme Court took a very courageous decision that if in the facts of the case it is found that a lot of coercion was there, if we allow the process to go on the plea that already has been tried and acquitted and it can't be reopened, that will destroy justice to the victims, destroy their faith in the criminal justice system. Normally, courts do not have the power to set aside an entire proceeding. They can set aside the judgment. Courts often, when you succeed in appeal or succeed in revision, they set aside the judgment, they will remand it back for fresh consideration. But this is an extraordinary case. The Supreme Court said, I will set aside the entire proceedings which went on in the court, they will simply vanish as if they never took place. It's a good instance of positive application of victimology. Negative applications is where the Malimat committee comes forward with suggestions that everyone who is guilty must be punished. It doesn't matter if innocent people are also punished. I mean, that's a different matter. So, from the point of view of victimology, today a lot of discussion is going on. But what is to be understood is that even earlier, there were instances where law was concerned, while the criminal justice system was as it was, concerned about the rights of the accused to a large extent as is complained of. It showed concern for the protection of the weaker sections of society who are socially in a weak position. in whose case offences that take place against them must be expeditiously tried, fairly tried, and the law must be strengthened. To that nobody took objection. No human rights organization took objection, because it is not as if we are concerned only about the accused. We are concerned very much about the weaker sections and the offences that take place against them. What we are saying is, don't put these things against each other. Now, laws which were enacted from that point of view, for instance, the Scheduled Caste and Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act, a powerfully drafted piece of legislation. Similarly, what is called dowry killing, section 304B of the Indian Penal Code. Domestic harassment, which has always been regarded as part of the accepted way of life. For the first time in 1983, Parliament said it's a crime. It has always been accepted as part of life that a husband will beat his wife, will harass his wife. We may say, we may pity her, but nobody thought it was a crime in the sense of a penal offence. Parliament says it's a crime, it's a penal offence. And in all these offences, the procedure was made more stringent, putting some part of the burden upon the accused than would normally be done. It was felt to be right. Unfortunately, here again the lack of training comes in. Neither the judiciary nor the police, neither the investigating officer nor the adjudicatory machinery has the necessary social training to appreciate the need, the importance of these enactments, and they have suffered very badly because of that. The police still have the excuse. Or if scheduled caste people in a village go and give a complaint, the police invariably will say, you are part of one village, you must adjust and live there, you have to work in their fields, they have to give you work, you can't come and quarrel. He is humiliated in the name of caste. On the ground of his, he doesn't say in the name of caste, on the ground of being a scheduled caste, scheduled tribe person, in a place in public view, that is the expression used, in a place in public view, that's an offence. Now what is in a place in public view means what? It does not mean the offence must have happened in public view. Offence must have happened in a place which is a place which the public can view. It may not be viewing at that time. At that time nobody will see. It is a place which is capable of being viewed by the public. It is not entirely private place which nobody can ever look into. That should be the understanding. But our High Court has gone to the extent of interpreting in a place in public view as if it is same thing as in public view. So cases where a case where a tribal boy was humiliated by a Brahmin officer of the Bharat Petroleum Corporation Limited inside the office. Office of Bharat Petroleum Corporation, anybody can enter. Not anybody in the sense. People who have work can enter, ring the bell and go inside if the attender outside permits. The High Court said it is not a public place and therefore there is no offence under the SC/ST Act. That was the first judgment, done 12 years ago. 4 years ago, a case from Nellore. The district agriculture officer's office, some small farmer who happens to be a Dalit goes into the office, gets very angry. We all know why farmers are so angry these days. Gets angry with the agriculture officer. That fellow abused this man in the name of caste. The case goes to the court. Our High Court says, office of agriculture officer is not a public place. So he is acquitted. Next step, this is the case which I am dealing with on the side of the Dalit. I have filed a religion in the High Court. Next step is, the worker is a Dalit, it is a sawmill, a timber depot where they cut timber and sell it. He is dragged to the employer's office room and said, you are stealing the timber and selling it. Abused in the name of Mara, Madiga, whatever it is, community. Our High Court has stayed the prosecution saying that the office of a timber depot is not a public place. Now, if you go to the timber depot to buy timber, you go to the office to pay the money or to place the order. You don't give it to the gateman. Any customer has to enter the office, but our High Court says it is not a public place. This is just one instance of how the courts, because of lack of sensitivity that matches the intention of the legislature in making such acts, have been destroying the. And so when we speak of victimology, the weakest victims are in our society are those who come from socially weak communities. Could be women as a community or Dalits as a community, tribals as a community. Criminal laws which are specially intended for giving them extra protection have been weakened badly by the courts. As the case is concerned, I have nothing to say. Raping and killing a minor girl is unpardonable offence. Our stand as human rights activists is that death penalty shall be removed from the statute book. It's necessary to make a distinction here. I am life imprisonment. You are entitled to say I would not support if you say. Don't release him as early as you would release another kind of a murder. Nobody is released before 12 years unless he is very close to the ruling party. That's a different matter. Normally they spend 12 years, 14 years, 15 years in jail. Just give him enough, the kind of food that he will get as a prisoner inside a jail. instead of simply idling and rotting inside jail and becoming further antisocial, make him an attender in an orphanage, where at least by serving small children, he will become a better human person, without of course giving him the kind of comforts that he would get outside. This is a proposal that NHRC has given. One can think of such thing. I am not asking you to come to a conclusion right now. One can think of this alternate.
There also comes the question of victim as such. More often than not, the victim feels aggrieved because of the way the procedure is. I mean, he doesn't get justice. So isn't it better if we enact law that once it is proved, like you said, in a less vague case, in this case, there is nothing denying that fact that the victim is there. So now the state should be obligatory to rehabilitate the victim much before we can even punish the criminals. That can go on at whatever level is this thing.
Our discussion of victimology, this distinction has been made. That is, the rehabilitation of the victim should not be connected with the punishment of the accused.
So my point was that the court should be first giving an order for the rehabilitation of the victim. We will deal with the criminal. That will take its time. I am saying in the first instance, once it has been proved this girl has been raped, we must talk of rehabilitation first of that girl rather than talking of that police has to prove. I am saying that in the first instance, let's rehabilitate that person so that that feeling of being alienated, at least it is lessened for some time.
In fact, in the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act, as far as the rules of Andhra Pradesh are concerned, this is already being implemented. Once a complaint is made by a person of SC/ST community that he or she has been, offence has been committed, the process of compensation rehabilitation starts from that stage itself without waiting for the trial. But what they have done is, the amount of compensation is divided. A certain amount will be given at the initial stage. If the investigation succeeds in finding yes, something has happened, file a charge sheet, the rest of the compensation will be given. If it turns out to be a false complaint, they won't take back what is given in the beginning. So the process is now already underway under this act. I think it is a good suggestion that it should be there for all offences where those who are socially weak are affected in some sense or the other are victims. That's a suggestion which can become part of the victimological understanding of the criminal justice system. It says, see, it's something like this. The difficulty in the case of a death of a woman in her husband's house is all the witnesses are going to be the relatives of the husband. They may have had some affection for her when she was alive, but they won't go to the extent of speaking against their own son, brother, whoever. So getting independent evidence is very difficult. And often in our social structure, that house also will be located within the community of that person. So the kith and kin will be living on. So they also may not come to the court and give evidence, though they may be angry with their fellow for having harassed her. So difficulty was that proving that that fellow is responsible for her death was very difficult. So 304B is a very interesting provision which says that if a woman dies within 7 years of marriage, if the death is unnatural, and if within a reasonable time before the death there was dowry harassment, then that itself is offence. Nothing more need be proved that he put the poison in her mouth or he forced her to commit suicide or hanging. These three things are sufficient. If she died within 7 years of marriage, if there was some evidence of dowry harassment before marriage, and the death was unnatural, that itself is offence of dowry death. Nothing more is required to be proved. And so if these facts come on record, it is the burden shifts onto the husband to show that she died otherwise than by his acts. In that sense, the burden of proof shifts. Just as in the case of custodial rape also. A rape inside police custody, or rape of a woman who is a subordinate employee by a superior officer within an establishment. In such instances also, or gang rape. In these instances, once the fact of sexual intercourse is proved, the burden shifts onto the man to show that he did not force himself upon her. To that extent, the burden is shifted. It's a very regulated way of shifting burden.
So it's not in the case of harassment, it's only in the case of...
498A does not shift the burden. 304B shifts the burden. That is, the domestic harassment does not shift the burden to the husband. Death within 7 years shifts the burden to this extent onto the husband. When they never call me, they call Professor Hargopal, he goes and gives lectures. He is in a better position to tell you how they reacted. They take it as, in our high school we used to have moral classes and so on. We used to take it as a holiday. Otherwise, we have physics, chemistry, mathematics are difficult. The period called moral period we would take as a light period as a holiday. Same thing for them. And they crack jokes and.
It's told that most of the prisoners are from Dalits and minority sections. What's the role of APCLC in protecting their rights?
Well, I am no longer an APCLC, I was there. The role of the human rights groups, see, it's not a question of protecting rights. The basic thing is to, as far as those who are in prison as under trial prisoners, because they are not able to get somebody to file a bail application, stand surety for them, we have on many occasions approached the district judge and tried to persuade him to give them bail on personal bond. And sometimes cases have been filed in the High Court. High Court also has given a cautious direction depending on the nature of the offence, try to give them bail on personal bond. That kind of assistance we have been giving, both as lawyers and as activists. But a more important thing which I think we have been consistently doing is to make society understand the nature of crime. After all, we all know that crime is possible for everyone. Then why is it that if you take a caste census within the prison, you will almost not find the upper caste there. Even if they come, by the time you finish your census, they would have gone out. They get bail. Often they sit in the superintendent's office and get bail and go away. They don't even enter the... Whereas communities which you don't find outside, you will find inside the... Communities whose existence you may not know, you will know when you go to jail. So I spent about 3 months in the Warangal Central Prison. I found many communities I had not heard of when I was outside. Now, this does not show anything about the nature of human beings. Everybody is capable of crime. But the nature of crime in a stratified society, an unequal society, is that either those who are at a disadvantaged position are pushed into crime, or that acts committed by them alone are defined as crime. Getting it and breaking somebody's door, entering into the house, taking away money is theft, robbery, deceit. A cashier at a bank doing the same thing, it becomes either a misappropriation, it's called a white collar offence. At most, he may be proceeded departmentally against, otherwise he may only lose his job, he won't go to jail. Both are theft. In fact, that fellow will be stealing less. This fellow can steal lakhs. An ordinary thief can never steal lakhs. So the social nature of crime, which defines crime in such a way that people from disadvantaged communities get caught, that I think we have been trying to explain to society. So people may not see crime only in terms of organized criminal gangs. Understand it socially. Then you will be able to react rationally to kind of the proposal Malimat committee is trying to give. Nobody shall be pardoned, everybody shall be harshly punished. It would include a lot of people who are pushed into crime because the way crime is structured and the way crime is defined. That social understanding we have been aiming to give to society more than anything.